So it's really cold in my apartment, and I wanted to read more story, so I am back in the cutest sweatshirt ever. So hopefully if you're watching this, we have figured out the first video and got them put together. I'm going to move this back a little bit. I'm currently figuring out, there we go. You're going to see my boxy head. You're welcome. All right. Necklaces are fixed. It's not choking me anymore. So if you're saying this one, I got the last video figured out, and now you're on this one on chapter 7 of our book, which is, our book is I Survived the American Revolution, because apparently Miss Gusler is stuck on the American Revolution and can't move on. So here I am. Here you are. Here we are, virtually together. Miss you so much. I just got really hyper all of a sudden, so this should be fun. I'm letting a movie editor load right now, so I'm filming all in one day, so you can understand, I can understand. My movie editor is loading, so while it's loading, and I can figure out how to do that after this one, hopefully I don't get any eruptions in this one, we're on to chapter 7. 3:15 p.m. We are in New York. Keep that in mind. Nate decided to jump on a ship and get away from Storch, landed in New York City, where there's a war now going on. So Nate charged back to the waterfront. His best hope was to catch the Valerie back to Connecticut. He'd figure out what to do when he got there. If he couldn't sneak onto the Valerie like last time, he'd beg the captain to take him. He'd offer to scrub the decks, carry out the dead rats, anything. But Nate was too late. He reached the dock just as the Valerie was sailing away. He tore down the dock, yelling, "Stop! Wait! Come back!" But the soldiers couldn't hear him. And even if they could, Nate knew the captain wouldn't turn the ship around for some nobody kid. Now what would Nate do? He stared out into the harbor, and as though the answer might be floating in the water. And that's when he spotted them. 2 enormous sailing ships. They were coming right from the south and seemed to be headed right for the city. Nate's heart lifted up. Maybe he'd find a job after all. But as the ships came closer, he realized there were not regular sailing ships like Papa's. They were bigger. They rose proudly out of the water, each with the 12 sparkling white sails gleaming in the sun. As they turned slightly, Nate saw that both ships had a small square opening along the sides, and poking out of each of the square was a black muzzle of a cannon. They were like gigantic black serpents peering out from their caves. Flags of England flapped from the ship's masts. They were British warships. Nate stared with a mix of fear and fascination, like the time he found the scorpion in his hammock. All his life he'd been hearing the stories about the British Navy. It was the mightiest on earth, with hundreds of warships prowling in the seas. The greatest British warship of them all were called men of war. Floating cities that could hold 1,000 men and almost 100 big cannons. Each cannon would blast a 24-pound ball that would streak through the air faster than a person could even blink. There was no weapon on earth as powerful as a big cannon. Nate knew it took 5 men to load and fire each one. One ball could punch through a stone fortress wall. It would rip through a line of soldiers. It could turn a house into rubble. It could blow a hole in any enemy warship, dooming it to an underwater grave. But the crew of a big warship didn't just fire off one cannonball at a time. They fired dozens of cannonballs at once, unleashing a crushing wave of metal balls. A man of war could destroy a city within hours. Nate's blood turned cold as he watched the 2 warships stream down the southern tip of the city. A crowd of American soldiers had joined Nate at the dock. They shouted out curses and shook their fists, and then a thundering explosion shook the ground. Kaboom! The explosion rattled Nate's bones and almost sent him leaping into the water in fear. But then he realized that the blast hadn't come from either of the British ships. Across the river in Brooklyn, big puffs of gray smoke rose from a hilltop. When the curtains of smoke cleared, Nate could see 10 cannons lined up in a row. Kaboom! 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 They blasted away the British ships. And then came blasts from somewhere even closer, on this side of the river. The Americans must have put cannons all around the city. Soldiers were crowding the docks now. 2 men stood behind Nate. They screamed out insults to the British ships. "Putting on a little show for us, you devils," one jeered. "We'll blast you up to the moon." The American cannons thundered and boomed. The air was filled with sharp metal stink of gunpowder smoke. Soldiers whooped and cheered after every blast. Kaboom! Huzzah! Kaboom! Huzzah! None of the American cannonballs hit the ships. Each splashed down harmlessly into the river. But the soldiers didn't seem to care. They roared and taunted, "Sink those cowards!" But then Nate noticed that the bigger of British warships had slowed down. A tongue of flame flicked out of one of its cannons. Kaboom! An odd sizzling sound filled the sky overhead. Someone screamed, and then crash! A cannonball came down, smashing a horse just a few yards from where Nate stood. The ground shook. Shards of wood rained down. A man shouted, "Run!" Chapter 8. Nate took off, joining the stampede of terrified soldiers rushing away from the docks. He ended up alone in an alley, huddling in the doorway of a stone building. He knew trying to hide was useless. No building would protect him from the force of a cannonball. But he couldn't just stand out in the street. He squeezed himself tighter into the doorway and tried not to think about the gruesome stories Papa's men used to tell about men who had their heads blown off by cannonballs. What a fool Nate was. He'd never make it out of here on his own. He wasn't tough like Slash O'Shea. When Slash was just 14, the merchant ship he worked on was destroyed in a storm. Only a few men survived, including Slash. And what'd he do next? He joined the British Navy. England was in the middle of a huge war with France and Spain. Slash was stationed on a man-of-war on the cannon deck. He was a powder monkey, which meant it was his job to rush the heavy bags of explosive gunpowder to the men loading the cannons. Powder monkeys had to be small and fast like real monkeys, and as brave as lions. Because cannons didn't just kill the enemy. Sudden sparks, too much gunpowder, any small mistake could cause an accidental explosion. It was one of those fiery accidents that left Slash without his right hand. After that, the Navy didn't want him anymore. But Slash didn't curl up just like a little shrimp. No. He went on to be the greatest pirate ever. Thinking about Slash calmed Nate down a bit and put that strong, shimmering feeling inside his chest again. Nate closed his eyes and pictured Papa's face. He tried to imagine Eliza's hand gripping his. When Nate finally opened up his eyes, the explosions had faded. The smoke had mostly cleared. Those British warships must have sailed away. Nate had peeled himself from the stone wall. Now he just wanted to get out of this battlefield. And if he couldn't escape on a boat, he'd just have to walk. The whiff of gunpowder still prickled Nate's nose. But the danger seemed to have passed. The soldiers on the streets were back to their work with their shovels and axes. Nate walked north, hoping to find the road out of the city. He passed a big lawn that had turned into a huge army camp. Every inch of grass was covered with tents. Row after crooked row of the grimiest, droopiest tents Nate had ever seen. Nate wove through a crowd of soldiers building an enormous wall out of dirt and rocks. A man's voice shouted from somewhere behind him, "Nate!" Nate ignored it. There had to be dozens of Nathaniels in the city. But the voice shouted again, "Nathaniel Fox!" Nate's heart stopped. His mind spun until he understood who he had to be. One of Storch's men. Before I read this last sentence, there's a picture. He's walking through with all the tents and all the soldiers. He watched it. His wretched uncle had a whole crew of muscled bullies he hired to collect money from people who owed him. And now one of those men had tracked Nate down. He was going to drag him back to Storch for more beatings. Nate took off in a panic. He sprinted across the street. He had just made it when a strong hand grabbed the hold of the back of his shirt. Nate wriggled and squirmed until he wrenched himself free. He rolled around and raised his fists ready to fight. He lifted his chin and staring dead on onto the face of the man chasing him. Nate's mouth fell open in shock. It was a young soldier with a goofy, gap-toothed smile. A mop of bright red curls spilled out from under the crumpled green triangle hat. Before Nate could say anything, the man grabbed Nate into a crushing, joyful hug. It was his old friend from Papa's crew, Paul Dobbins. So I'm going to stop there, and we will start with chapter 9 in the next video. I hope y'all are very much enjoying this book as much as I am. I have never read the I Survived series, and I'm loving it. So I hope you are too. I'm very curious as to what Paul's gonna do. Is he gonna help Nate? Is he gonna get Nate into the army? Is Nate gonna get back? Is Nate gonna be safe? I have so many questions, and I cannot wait to figure them out. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye.